Welcome to the Zinnov podcast. You're listening to our Business Resilience series, where we bring to you conversations between eminent industry stalwarts and thought leaders from across the globe as they discuss their insights on overcoming challenges and the mindset that help them navigate the journey of crisis, resilience, and growth.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Business Resilience series of the Zinnov podcast. I'm your host for today's session, Nilesh Thakker, the president of Zinnov. Today we are speaking to Sam Fletcher, the head of talent intelligence at PayPal. Sam established the talent intelligence function for PayPal and has been instrumental in driving talent engagement strategies, workforce analytics, location strategy, and innovative approaches to attractive and retaining top talent. A global expert on talent intelligence and workforce planning, Sam has developed cutting-edge solutions to organizations around the world, leveraging data to gain competitive advantages. Welcome, Sam. We are thrilled to have you here.
Thank you, Nilesh. Thank you for having me.
That's great. Let's dive in. Sam, as remote and hybrid work models become more prevalent across industries, how are leading organizations adapting their talent acquisition, engagement, and retention strategies to build a productive and engaged distributed workforce? What are the unique talent-related challenges and opportunities companies are navigating in this context?
So I think leading companies are overwhelmingly thinking about two different things. The first is, where does hybrid or remote working or having a distributed workforce make the most sense? And a lot of companies have done that, especially going back the last 2-3 years. They've done that as a play for access to talent and access to high demand talent in particular. So approach to remote work has been to access that talent and remain competitive, as most companies were taking that approach for a while. I think also it's looking at fitting in with company culture. So if you think about, does remote or does having a distributed workforce really fit with the company culture? So looking at companies like Dropbox, it makes perfect sense that they would have a distributed workforce and a remote work culture because that's what their product is leaning towards in terms of virtual productivity. Mm-hmm. The other element that they're looking at overwhelmingly for this is looking at adapting talent and HR processes to work with a decentralized workforce. And that's something a lot of companies have been trying to get to grips with that have found benefits from having a decentralized workforce and remote working and wanting to remain having a portion of their workforce decentralized. So they're trying to look at now talent intelligence teams coming to the fore, and they're getting established really to look at a more data-informed approach. And I think also talent acquisition, learning and development, comp and bends teams are having to work together much more closely in these organizations to actually come up with the right strategies to allow management of a distributed workforce to be done successfully, because it's a very different style of work arrangements that they're seeing now.
Okay. So I was actually talking to a CHRO of a global organization just a couple of days ago, and she was saying that the executive team feels that there's a loss of productivity because of the hybrid and remote. Have you seen any data to substantiate that, and how are companies overcoming that?
Yeah, I think it depends very much on the kind of work being done in the different teams. There will be lack of productivity for some particular functions, some particular workloads that are happening. Equally, I think how we're thinking about productivity should change for different organizations. And if you think about pair programming and software engineering, typically you would have two software engineers sat with a screen in front of them, looking at code, sharing ideas, running through it together. And if that's the definition of kind of productivity and collaboration, a lot of software engineers now are turning to Gen AI tools, looking at Copilot-like technology where they're really pair programming with an AI, and that's supporting them in developing their code, and they're potentially turning to Gen AI to ask for questions that they may have done with their peers and colleagues as well. So it's interesting to see how that's developing. It's not going to replace a good conversation with an industry expert that's sat at the desk next to you straight away, but it's an opportunity there. And I do think productivity, particularly for young professionals entering the workforce as well, missing out on that face-to-face interaction, going into an office, those water cooler conversations, I think that's an opportunity that companies shouldn't be neglecting. People entering the workforce as well. I think it's very difficult to replicate that unless you're in an in-person office. So yeah, I think that the data points to different things depending on how you look at it and depending on the workload, the workforce, but also the demographics of the employee base that you're speaking to as well. It will look very different depending on how you're cutting that.
Okay. Do you ever see companies going back to 5 days from work, or that's unlikely to happen?
I think there's a lot of companies that will default back to that because it is the standard and it is something that has made sense, particularly for organizations when you think about traditional banking, it is a very much a 5-day working week, particularly in client-facing roles. They have to be available, they have to be in office. But I will think you'll see very different modes, different models working for different companies. And I think the only thing that we can plan on is there being variety and there being change. Some companies will make 5 days in office a competitive advantage. Others will make 4 days at home a competitive advantage. And they'll be appealing to very different styles of workforce and working priorities. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves, I think, over the next few years, whether we slowly go back towards 5 days in the office, or the 3-day in office or 4-day in office is the new normal, and Mondays and Fridays people tend to work from home. We'll have to see.
Okay, great. Thank you. With constantly evolving skill demands in today's economy, it seems like we need to learn a new skill almost every other week. How are talent teams utilizing data and analytics to identify critical skill gaps within their own workforce and develop targeted upskilling, reskilling, and hiring programs?
Yeah, I think its skills are so fluid and so variable. And I think every company that you probably would look into has a very different definition and how they're thinking about skills. But also legacy job structures aren't really cut out for a skills first approach. I think 99% of organizations that you'll look at, they're very reliant on job families or job titles as a formal structure for how they're thinking about their workforce. But I think with the proliferation of data and actually data systems and HRIS systems becoming more complex and skills enabled, being able to understand skills adjacencies, being able to understand synonyms for different skills as well, and which skills are correlated and which skills have kind of adjacency, there's a real opportunity for companies to start being more proactive about skills and actually integrate skills into their ecosystem. And if you think about years ago, not that long ago though, if you were thinking we need to hire a lot of other data scientists, you would look into your organization and say we have 300, 500 data scientists because they sit in that job title or their job family. And the approach would be, okay, if we need more data scientists, we go out and hire more. Whereas now, when you're thinking about skills first approach and you're breaking down the job of a data scientist into its component skills, you may find that actually you have a population of software engineers, software developers, maybe data analysts that are 80% of the way to being a data scientist in terms of how you define that. So there's a real opportunity to then look internally, understand the skills gap that some of these professionals may have, and understand looking at more empirical data in terms of what time does it take to acquire some of these missing skills. You can bake that into your learning and development programs, your professional development programs, and there's a real opportunity there to maximize on internal talent through understanding of skills and taking a skills first approach. So there's a real opportunity there for companies that can get the skills understanding and build full skills taxonomies, but it is a very difficult task to undertake for any organization.
Are you using any tools or programs or which help you with that? Or what would you recommend an HR professional do for this?
Yeah, so I think if you're understanding your internal and external skills, I think starting to build up a skills taxonomy, and this doesn't have to be too granular, you can start at a fairly high level in terms of thinking about capabilities, thinking about key skills that you need in particular workloads and job families, and starting to build a picture of how your workforce looks. And equally as well, looking at external labor market data forces you to do this in a little bit more of a pragmatic way, because you may have standard occupation codes in the US or in other locations, whereas a lot of markets out there do not have standardized workloads built into their reporting systems. So if you're trying to look at labor market data, breaking it down to a skills-based approach and translating what my data scientist might mean in terms of the combination of skills, you can start to troll through social media profiles, professional social profiles, CVs, and data sets, and actually look at skills in that way. So I think talent intelligence and looking externally has prompted a lot more of a skills focus, because then you can better align potential candidates and assess candidates coming in by looking at skills first, rather than looking at job titles, looking at have they done this same job before with a similar terminology, and using that as a hiring decision. So I think looking externally is a really good window, and using that data set to start thinking about skills versus trying to build it internally first as well.
Great. Can you share some specific examples of how talent insights are enhancing the quality of your hiring decisions, improving engagement and retention, and driving overall performance of companies? Like, how do you use talent insights? Talent intelligence is a pretty important function. I don't know whether every company uses it effectively. So maybe you are the expert here. If you can help our listeners understand that. So.
Sure, yes. I think talent intelligence in many organizations is still sat in talent acquisition. It's the kind of the group that's incubated talent intelligence in many companies. And when you have talent intelligence sat in talent acquisition, you can start to look at data around quality of hire, for an example. It is an area that a lot of teams start to focus on. And when they're thinking about quality of hire, it's very good at tackling some of the biases that hiring managers or hiring communities might have. So, for one example, if you are hiring for a product manager who's thinking about UX, UI, or product managers in the team, they may really want to hire from Apple, as an example. Or if you're hiring data scientists and software engineers, they may want to hire from Google and Amazon because they have very good capabilities. But really, when you're looking at the data and you're looking at the eventual placement, the attrition, the professional development, and the achievements of those individuals coming through the hiring process, they may not be the best fit for your organization. You may have a very different culture, a very different technology stack, and they may not be set up for success. So looking at elements that feed into quality of hire, as one example, can really help benefit the talent acquisition process and really bring a very objective view to hiring decisions and breaking some of those inherent biases that people may come with. There's many other opportunities to embed that in at talent acquisition, but I think talent intelligence has to be tied into people analytics and workforce data to really become fully effective. And I think looking at talent retention, looking at actually building talent data that supports business objectives, it has to be holistic. It has to have a 360-degree view. And I think that becomes very complementary because typically HR data teams are very introspective. They look at your own people's data, but they miss some of those benchmarks. Whereas talent intelligence focuses very much externally for most organizations, but does miss on an internal view. So I think when you bring those together, you get a very strong, capable data team that's able to really match up data with business objectives, but also connect data silos in internal data, in external data, in things like real estate tax to really inform workforce strategies at an enterprise scale. And that gets really exciting.
Great. The role of a chief talent officer or head of talent intelligence is becoming increasingly strategic, as you just mentioned. How has the function evolved? And you talked about internal and external data and all that. How do you align the business objectives and cultivate a future-ready workforce? What do you be looking for in a chief talent officer?
Yeah, so I think having the data enablement and the data support is absolutely critical now for companies that are addressing talent strategies. And still, I think we're still coming through a period where most talent acquisition groups are very much an execution-focused team. The business comes up with a strategy and an approach, and they decide what they need to execute on that, and then they give that to the talent acquisition team to go and hire those people in those locations. And I think that needs to be a closer relationship. So a chief talent officer or a head of talent intelligence that is getting involved in these kind of projects, I think needs to very cognizantly bring those two groups together and actually bring talent acquisition, at least from a data perspective, into some of those strategic conversations. And talent intelligence has been very effective in what I've always deemed going upstream. So talent intelligence can support very much with open requisitions that are in specific locations where there may be a difficulty in accessing talent, or they need to understand different talent motivations. But really, by taking that upstream and actually making sure that businesses are open requisitions and planning for locations to grow their headcount with the right mix of skills base that are present there, the competitor hiring activity that's going on in that location, and actually that they're setting themselves up for success. I think bringing talent intelligence and understanding labor markets alongside real estate decisions, alongside economists and people are looking at government relations, all of these conversations need to go on at the same time, and access to talent and labor availability needs to be one of those top agenda items alongside things like real estate to make sure that these decisions are being made correctly and setting the business up for success as well.
So, Sam, I think we already spoke about the skills required in the digital economy are constantly changing. So, how are talent intelligence teams working to identify and address the emerging skill gaps? Like, how do you determine, okay, here is what we need as an organization we need to focus on? Because sometimes those skills are maybe 6 months or a year ahead of what you need. And obviously, you can't start looking for talent when you need them. You need to be looking before. So, what have you done, and what have other of your other peers who do? How do you go about figuring out what's the company going to need in the future?
Yeah, I think the first step in that process is always connecting with the business leaders internally and understanding what are their changing capabilities? What are their changing needs in their organization that they see in the market based on changing customer demand, based on changing market conditions? And that's always the kind of kicking off point, if you like. And talent intelligence teams can be proactive in that and bring suggestions and an outside-in view. So they may look at how competitors are changing their organizational structure or the skills that their competitors are hiring for. And that can be a very small increase, but actually the start of a signal that actually there is a change in terms of skills that are being hired in their organizations. So having that initial conversation, I think, is critical around what the business believes its changing needs are. And then you can start to tie that back to skills and labor and capabilities. So one thing that talent intelligence teams have access to that's always massively impactful is competitor hiring data and looking at which skills are being increasingly asked for and in demand in similar markets or similar locations, and see, okay, if all of our big tech competitors are hiring specific skill sets more than they were, or actually hiring them for the first time, those can be really telling signals around the changes in their business environment or the changes in their kind of skills and their workforce. And that leads into greater strategic decisions and conversations as well. So you may actually be able to identify future competitors based on purely what they're hiring for. So if you're a traditional a banking company, and you have payments and you have wealth management and you have investments arms, you may find organizations that are predominantly a tech company that you may not have really competed with, but they've started to hire banking professionals or payments professionals or wealth professionals, investment professionals within them. That might indicate that they're actually looking at getting into the same space. We see this with traditional automobile companies that have started hiring EV experts years ago, and then that was actually the signals that they were moving into the electronic vehicle space, was because they were hiring these skills to start with, and that was a very telling signal that they were then going to be moving into an EV space rather than a traditional combustion engine setup. So I think looking at the hiring activity of competitors can be very telling, and actually looking at what's going on in the market. How is that changing? How is that demand evolving? And actually, are we ahead of that? Are we making sure that we're also keeping pace and looking for these skills that we see out there happening in the market? So I think that's always a very rich indicator as to how you need to be thinking about skills, is looking at what's going on in the market as well.
Okay. No, that's great. I think that's very important. Are you using some tools again to identify competitive skills hiring and all that, or you just looking at LinkedIn? What do you normally do for that?
Yeah, there's a number of different platforms that will aggregate kind of data from job adverts. And I think traditionally in research and executive search and recruiting, you might look at one job advert at a time. But now there's platforms and tools like Drought that we're a customer of, where they will aggregate that data, they will compile skills, they will compile data from job adverts. And that's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of job adverts that have been passed in kind of different languages, and extracting skills, suddenly taking intelligence that you could get from one job advert at a time and then taking that to a data set of millions of job adverts. You start to see some really compelling trends in there as well. So there is tools and platforms that will do that for you, thankfully, and start to scrape that data, which is, speeds things up a little bit.
Awesome. Okay. Now, one of the other trend which we have experienced and we actually work with companies is on harnessing global talent, right? Talent is now company. Earlier, people used to go where the jobs are. Now companies are going where the people are. So how are companies harnessing global talent to drive innovation and competitiveness? One of the things they were doing was cost arbitrage, so stay cost. But now I'm seeing more and more they're doing it for innovation and growth and competitiveness. Have you seen that trend? And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I think depending on the status of companies, they're doing very different things. I think when you look at some of the large multinational corporations, they tend to be very hub focused. So there will be large centers in the San Francisco Bay Area or Bangalore or Beijing or places like that, where they focus very much on big hubs. But I think when you're looking at different global locations, there is a lot of opportunity for non-hub locations that have very well-established talent pools. And hiring in a more distributed way allows scale-up companies or companies that aren't that large of size to be able to connect with talent and hire talent that they need to build their products and deliver on their objectives without having to compete quite as heavily. I think I'd be very worried in trying to build a technology organization in Bangalore or New York or San Jose at the moment, because finding good people, particularly if you're an AI company, is very challenging, and you have to just pay over the odds to secure that talent. Whereas if you focus on smaller markets that are still very well developed. There's less competitive kind of plays going on there. The labor market isn't quite as tight, so access to talent can be a little bit better, and you're not paying quite as much as well because you're not competing with some of the big corporations. So I think that strategy, a lot of scale-ups and startup companies are capitalizing on very well. They're looking at markets and looking at locations and hiring in kind of some of the tech hubs in EMEA, Southeast Asia, and Latin America in particular, where there's not a significant size of a talent pool, but actually it's sufficient to meet their needs of their organization, and they don't have to compete quite as heavily. So there's a real opportunity there in terms of harnessing global talent, particularly if you can hire fully remotely, where you can be a little bit more talent focused and you don't have to be quite as competitive in some ways.
And how are companies, obviously it's great to have access to talent, but now you're increasing the need for collaboration and communication. How are companies, have you seen what has worked well in these cases?
Yeah, I think making sure that there is really clear expectations upfront around connecting with remote talent, how they're being onboarded to the company. I think the one thing that most companies have found through hiring remotely is the stickiness, to not have a better word for it, of employees. If you're sat at home somewhere, as I am, in a home office, it's much, much easier to change jobs. You can interview at any time of the day. You can speak to different employees that are hiring remotely. Companies are no longer just competing with who has an office over the road or in the same city. So I think that kind of has become quite challenging, and they have to think about different ways to engage and retain remote employees in that way. Equally, from a diversity and inclusivity perspective, I think a lot of employees have to be very cognizant and very aware of what remote work opens up for them in terms of diversity opportunities, but what it closes off. We will have some populations where remote work really helps underrepresented groups find employment opportunities and for companies to connect with that talent through remote working. But equally, that might be very prohibitive for employees in certain demographics or particular age groups where they may want to be in the office. They learn best through close collaboration in person with peers, or they want to be in a social environment, and actually sitting at home logging on through a computer isn't meeting their social needs as an individual. So I think companies have a very big challenge in balancing that, because sometimes there's a perception that most employees want remote, but that's not always the case as well. So companies have to navigate that very carefully and listen to employees and be very proactive in social listening and surveys and engagement surveys to make sure that they are doing the right thing and appealing to all of their employees.
Sounds good. And before we wrap up, could you share a piece of advice for HR professionals looking to leverage data, AI, and latest technologies and tools in their talent management strategies effectively? You're an expert in this. So.
Yes, I think a lot of HR teams see it as being quite a mountain to climb in some ways, and they need perfect technology infrastructure. They need access to large language models. And actually, I think there's a lot of opportunity to just do good data work with what's available. And I think as well, a lot of HR leaders think that they have to have perfection in terms of their data sets and actually have everything in line and have things standardized and formalized first before they can do good work. But I think I'd just say get started. Anything that you're doing in data and actually utilizing data is beneficial from a starting point. And also helping their peers, helping their colleagues, and helping their own function become a little bit more data aware, thinking about how they can use data in their own roles day to day, and really building up that data awareness within their teams is a big kind of element of this. I think there's still a lot of HR organizations who don't understand data language. They don't understand really how to navigate data or talk about data, and they're not comfortable with that. And I think building that comfort as an organization is a great step for a HR group to take when they're looking at a transformation. And I think bringing in talent intelligence, engaging with people that are very data focused across their organization that may not be purely HR, there's a lot of opportunity for cross-function collaboration there. So I think, look at where you can start, look at the inroads that you can make, and look at who is surrounding you that's a bit more data savvy as well, and get them involved in the conversation.
Thank you so much. Just to summarize what Sam, you told us today, data, like in everything we do today, is pretty important in HR too. Get started with data. Don't look for perfection, and you will see that your talent acquisition, your talent retention, your talent management, your location strategy will just get better with that. Also, you mentioned reskilling and upskilling. look at, don't necessarily have to always go and hire from outside. Look at your skills adjacencies and see whether you can upskill the team which you already have, because that's obviously they already know the company well, and now just giving them the extra skills can get you a lot more productivity and a lot more engagement from that exercise. Also, the role of talent officer or a head of talent intelligence is becoming increasingly critical. It's sometimes hidden under the talent acquisition, but considering that how critical talent is for every company, it really needs to be thought of as a very important role where they are talking to business proactively rather than as a reaction to what the business needs are, help working with business to figure out where the company is going, what kind of talent needs are. And one other important aspect which you mentioned was looking at competitive data and see that would be a very the intelligence which you may be able to get from what other companies in your field or even adjacent field are doing. That may even help you not from a talent perspective, but just from an overall business perspective to be a lot more proactive. So great conversation. Thank you for your time, and thank you sharing all the perspectives, Sam, with us. So.
Thanks, Nilesh. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thanks all of you for turning into this episode. We will be back soon with another leader and another exciting topic. Till then, take care and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Business Resilience Series. Stay tuned for more such interesting episodes. You can listen to our podcast on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. To know more about Zinnov, visit our website, www.zinnov.com, or drop us a note at info@zinnov.com. Follow us on Twitter @Zinnov for regular updates on our content. Thank you again for listening to the Business Resilience Series of the Zinnov Podcast.